Welcome to Women Creating Change. This is our Table Talk online, and we thank you for joining us today. Be sure to like us on social media. We appreciate it. I'm Angela Henry. I'll be your MC this evening. I'm a longtime supporter of this 105-year-old organization with the vision that all women have the power to be change makers to create a more equitable New York City. We focus on expanding civic engagement opportunities for women who have not previously had a seat at the table. Carol Wasey is our president and CEO. Hi, Carol.
Hi there.
My sense of time has been so weird during this pandemic time. I think that's been for everybody. But this past week has been especially crazy. I can't believe that the election was only last week, but it was. And now what's on the docket for WCC in civic engagement post-election?
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I think, no matter what anyone's politics are, and of course, as a nonprofit 501c3, we're nonpartisan. We're focused on civic engagement. We care a lot about civic engagement and making sure that everyone can engage in ways that work for them, in the ways that they want, that support them, that impact and improve their own lives. And so we certainly were very involved gearing up for the election, working on the census in advance of the election, doing all that we had to do this year. There's been a lot on the agenda, and I think everyone, quite honestly, is tired, but I think there's also so much to celebrate this year when we look at the election and we look at the turnout alone, and who turned out and how they turned out and how they got engaged. And so much more happening when you look in New York at early voting, giving people a lot of more flexibility in engaging and participating. And that's always been our goal at WCC, back to our roots 105 years ago when we were fighting for the women's right to vote. And now that we've gotten through this election, we have a president-elect, and something else for us to celebrate is the vice president, not only the first woman in that role, but a woman of color, a first-generation American, an amazing woman who is, take all those labels away. This is an amazing human being who has done a lot and is very accomplished, independent of all of those labels that are being attributed to her. So I think there's a lot for us to celebrate, certainly as an organization that really tries to advocate for all women. So part of it is we really want to take a moment and celebrate that. So often we're just steeped in the work, and then we move on to the next thing. So we're celebrating a lot. And then as we move ahead, we also we set this up very intentionally before the election, because no matter the outcome of the election, we knew it was important to give everyone some guidance and thoughts and solicit ideas about how people could continue to be engaged. We talk about the election historically as one day. Now it's stretched out over many days, which is a really positive thing. And now as we move beyond the election, there's still a lot of work to do, and there always will be, and there's a lot of opportunity to get engaged. So first of all, as we still face some challenges just in the transition, and many of us have been involved in transitions before. This is a very unique one, in that there's some resistance to transition. So we just want to make sure we can move through this process effectively, efficiently, and appropriately. We want to finalize all the counts, make sure everything is appropriate, make sure everyone who has voted, if you voted, via absentee ballot, you can check to make sure your vote's counted. There's opportunities to correct. So there's a lot of things along those lines to make sure that happens. And then beyond that, we also want to make sure, we were really involved in the census, and on the heels of the census, if the census gets certified, there's going to be opportunities around redistricting, and there's opportunities to be involved in those processes to make sure they're not partisan. And we think that's really important as we move ahead, especially because we know that there's some significant undercounts, in part because the census was cut short, and in part because of a lot of confusion around how the census was managed. So we want to make sure all of that happens. So those are opportunities. Something we also really want to emphasize is that we, of course, we're all very focused on the national election, but there's really important local elections coming up. June is a very important time frame for us here in New York City. So we're already gearing up to think about how we make sure everyone can really participate in that, to really signal dates and getting to know candidates and really participating in those processes. And then moving even beyond that, in New York City, we talk a lot about community boards, and there's a lot of confusion around them. How do you get on them? Do you go to them? Do they make a difference? You know, so even just attending a meeting to start to get some understanding of what happens at those, they really do affect our local communities. And then we started in recent years, there's another way that through some of the city council monies, there's something called participatory budgeting, which many of you know about. And there's ways to get involved in how our monies are directed. Who better than people in the community to know how money should be spent and allocated, things that communities really care about. So we're going to be really involved in all of these areas, working with our partners to make sure everyone has a voice in these processes. And there's a lot of other ways. We'll, as a follow-up to this conversation today, we'll share a lot of the resources. We really want to hear from all of you. We know our speakers have some ideas about ways to participate, and we'll hopefully continue to be a conduit of some of those really important resources for people to stay engaged leading up to elections, during elections, and certainly as a follow-up to elections. So really happy to have our two guests with us, and Angela, always happy to have you lead us through these very important conversations.
Thanks, Carol. That's always exciting for me as well. And we have two renowned thought leader activists with us today to talk about what's next. L. Joy Williams and Wendy Weiser, welcome to you both. L. Joy is a highly sought after political strategist, public speaker, political analyst, and social justice activist. She currently serves as the president of the Brooklyn NAACP, one of the most generationally diverse branches in the country, and she's also the legislative coordinator for the New York State NAACP Conference of Branches. L. Joy has worked with prominent and notable political figures, including Stacey Abrams, State Attorney General Letitia James, New York City Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, and Cynthia Nixon, for whom she served as senior advisor during Nixon's gubernatorial run. She has been a regularly featured commentator on BET, Pacifica Radio, New York One, and MSNBC. I have seen you on Up with David Gura and Melissa Harris Perry's show, and of course, AM Joy. And L. Joy is also the creator, host, and producer of the civic education show #Sunday Civics on SiriusXM's Urban View. She is both Chairman Emeritus of Higher Heights for America and now serves as chair of the Higher Heights PAC. L. Joy travels the country, more virtually lately, I would imagine, training and advising and supporting efforts to build Black women's political power and leadership potential. We also welcome Wendy Weiser, Vice President for Democracy at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Since Wendy was a young adult, she has focused largely on civil rights work, including environmental work with civil rights focus. She has worked at both city and state levels on behalf of violence survivors and on the housing and employment discrimination that survivors face. For the past 16 years at the Brennan Center for Justice, Wendy has directed litigation, research, and advocacy efforts to enhance political participation and prevent voter disenfranchisement across the country. This includes voting rights in elections, money in politics and ethics, redistricting, census, rule of law, and fair courts. Wendy has authored multiple nationally recognized publications and articles on democracy issues. She has litigated groundbreaking lawsuits. She has testified before both houses of Congress and multiple state legislatures, and a lot of language in state legislation across the country has come from Wendy and her team. And she's provided policy and drafting assistance to public officials across the country. She is a frequent public speaker and media contributor on democracy issues, and we're delighted to have her with us today as well. Welcome, Wendy and L. Joy.
Thank you so much.
It's great to be here.
Great. Well, let me jump right in here with the remarkable elections of 2020. We know that election years tend to inspire high levels of civic engagement. Wendy and then L. Joy, what was different about this year?
Well, I'll start. This was a tremendous year for democracy, despite all the challenges. We have record voter turnout in America. More Americans voted than any time for over a century. A higher percentage of Americans. And despite the massive challenges of the pandemic, not only did people overcome them and get out to vote, but our election system worked. We really were worried that there were going to be massive meltdowns across the country, and there were certainly a lot of obstacles that we can talk about and that are not acceptable, but our system worked and voters turned out in record numbers. And that's something that we can be proud of and we should be celebrating.
I think also what you've seen, particularly here in New York, we can see is when we create structures and opportunities for people to make it easier for them to participate in different civic engagement process, you see people, and once they're educated about it, you see people actually turn out, actually engage. And here in New York State, where we have early voting, this wasn't the first election we had it, but it was certainly the first presidential election, and the first time campaigns and others really invested collectively and holistically into using the early vote period in New York State. And that's why you saw this sort of overwhelming participation. Some would say watching it, and nobody ever wants to stand in a line for everything, which is always confusing to me being a New Yorker, because we stand in line for a whole lot of things since we were teenagers. But but seeing people sort of participate in that process, and once you provide the opportunity, the information, and the training for people to engage in all aspects of our civic life, you see more people turning out. It's one of the reasons why we advocate, those of us who are activists in that space, advocate for more transparency, advocate for more entry points, whether it's from the community boards at the very micro level, all the way to something like early voting, is that when you provide additional opportunities, education, and emphasis on participation, and do not narrow participation to certain populations or certain areas, you do see a greater participation. Now, translate that nationwide, and you do have in presidential elections, right? Like that, we have all been conditioned throughout our lifetime that is when you tune in. You tune in during presidential elections. And I'm happy we're now moving to a period in two things. One, rather than focusing just on election day, we're focusing on an election season, even when it comes to presidential election years. Hopefully this carries not only over to our municipal elections, which is coming up next year, but then also midterm elections and other elections, that there's an election happening somewhere all the time, and sort of being ready, being that prime voter to always participate. And then the second issue is really to completely open up and talk openly and be transparent about what other things are happening in our civic life, and that in a way that we are not demonizing or chastising people for not having already known or participated, but more from a way to really invest in people understanding this is your entry point, this is the information about it. It doesn't matter that you weren't here since day one, you're here now, like let's get, let's make it happen. And that's really my focus in terms of civic engagement. It's sort of, I have this whole show that I do about the voter blame game, where we blame people for not being engaged, blame people for not being, and they didn't have the information, like, because people have guarded it to their benefit. And so the more we can open up, the more we can educate people about the process, the more we can sort of break those barriers and have more voices at the table. And the contention is a good thing, because we're not going to agree on everything. You want it to be open, you want it to be diverse voices. That is not going to come with consensus. What you're going to get is more people at the table. You're going to have to answer and deliver as to why things have been going this way and how we change them.
I just wanted to add on one thing, because I think that that's all absolutely right, or underscore two things. One, it is really critical to celebrate the changes that we made here in New York to expand access to voting, and that really did make a difference. There's still a ways to go and more work that we do here. But that really does make a difference, and it makes a difference in the reverse, when we go backwards and restrict access to voting in terms of participation and vote suppression. But also, the importance of public education and getting out the word, cannot be overstated. This year, so many people were focused on this election. So many people contributed to that public education, whether it be like every news station, every newspaper was posting information about the election. The Time to Vote Coalition with 2,000 companies that were informing their customers and their employee base and giving time off to vote. And just, there was a massive mobilization because people felt like the election was at risk at a level that we haven't seen before, and that we might not see again if we don't invest in it. So we can't just rely on that being self-sustaining. We need to sustain that, because that really did make a difference. But it's not going to happen automatically without a real investment.
Mm-hmm. I think your point, Eljoy and Wendy, you spoke about it too, this being comprehensive and holistic, I think really made a very big difference. I was very pleased to see President Obama during one of his rallies talking about the down ballot. You're not just voting for president. Look at what else is going on in your local community and what is reflected on the ballot. And I think that is going to help compel people to pay attention to June elections. As you said, Eljoy, there's an election going on someplace for something, and I think people are going to be more aware of that, definitely. How do we build on this momentum and encourage more kinds of civic engagement and continued civic engagement? It's a long time between now and June. What should we be doing in between to make sure that people stay engaged? We've got a lot of
Yeah, I actually wrote about that recently because I wrote a piece for Essence, just days before the last day of voting of Election Day, and talking about, no matter what the outcome would be, there are still a number of things stacked up immediately. And we talking about municipal elections, we're not only having municipal elections, but all across the country, we'll be electing new mayors in different cities. So those are certainly elections to pay forward to. But someone mentioned, I think you mentioned briefly, Angela, about the census, or maybe someone else did, and talking about what happens after that, right? So now we have supposedly census numbers. Supposedly the states will receive what their population numbers are shortly after the new year. Well, then we have the process of reapportionment, right? Where the states know how many congressional seats they have. They will then have to draw new lines, as well as draw new lines on the local level as well, whether that be city council, state legislature, things of that nature. That's something also that has a direct connection to how races are run later in terms of the midterms, or even going on 4 years from now. And so we need to be able to educate the public about participation in that process. Those are one of those things, and I'm sure Wendy can agree, that again, redistricting has been this mystical thing that happens that only lawyers and elected officials and political scientists are allowed to participate in. And that's simply not the case. The reason why we've gotten gerrymandered districts and all of these crazy things is because there has been no transparency, there has been no public engagement in that process. So one of the ways that we can continue that engagement is by educating people about that process, and it's different in each state. In New York, we so-called have an independent process that's, that has already begun. But, that spotlight, that light that needs to be turned on in terms of that process, so that we make sure that we do not have a heavy partisan or heavy political process of redistricting is important. And it goes to our political participation and our weight going further down the line. We were also talking about community boards. One of the things I found of how you hook people into civic engagement is locally. Presidential elections, like, everybody's going to be on that, right? Even corporations, as Wendy talked about, everybody's going to do something on, a presidential election because it affects everybody. It's the cool thing to do, what have you. But if you hook people into how their decisions and their activism impacts them locally, that once you walk out your door, you can walk by and be like, see that park? We did that. You know, see that, you know, we got a sidewalk. You know, I remember learning, being, you know, a New York City kid, and learning that everybody doesn't have sidewalks like in other places. And I'm like, where's your sidewalk? I was like, oh, the city doesn't pay for that, or things like that. Like, to be able to walk in your community and know that you were intricately part of a park, or garbage cleanup, or changing the structure of an organization, or having more daycare seats. Like, being able to walk by that and walk through your neighborhood and know that you were a part of that, that does something to people, where they're ready for the next thing. They're like, okay, we did that, now let's go on to the next thing in terms of how to improve and engage in our society. So we need to focus less on how to get people involved in the big things, because everybody's going to be on that bandwagon, but more of how do we educate and inform people to be engaged in the little bit of time that they have, because they have families and other things like that, in the local things where they can see a direct effect of their participation.
Wendy?
So I think that's absolutely right, and want to say I was very proud to be part of the New York City Charter Revision Commission that expanded participatory budgeting, so that more people can take part in very specific local decisions in their communities, and also strengthened something that's unique here in New York that allows for greater engagement by more communities of small donor public financing here in New York City, and that now is poised to move at the state level. We do want to thank Eljoy and the NAACP for being such inspiring leaders and allies on expanding small donor public financing. But this is actually a way that one of the areas where New York is actually doing better than the rest of the country in providing opportunities for participation and opening up the political process to a much broader array of voices, because you don't need to have millions of dollars or know really wealthy people in order to run campaigns, to be part of your community, or to actually be an important participant in the financing of campaigns. Because of our multiple match system, their candidates can rely on people in their community and friends and neighbors to build support, and that can be really transformative. And so I want to sort of flag that, not just in terms of people organizing at the local level, but we have an opportunity now, as this system is being built at the state level, to make this work. I think we need to put some pressure on the governor to fill the new public financing commission to get going, so that and the system could start being financed, so that the system, which is slated to go into effect in 2 years from now, is ready to go, and that the rest of the state can benefit from this process that we've had here in the city for a long time. I want to say on the redistricting and the census, it is a critical moment. It happens once in a decade, and we are left with the consequences for the rest of the decade. And the partisan gerrymander, or the racial discriminatory redistricting that was set a decade ago, impacts people for the entire decade and skews our politics and our policy outcomes and reduces people's power. And we have this moment now, both to be part of the process, and so that this new independent advisory commission is going to be holding public hearings. That's an opportunity for people to advocate for what their community should look like, and to get involved in the process, and to start pushing for what those lines should be and what a fair representation should look like. But I think we also need to put pressure at the national level. We're not done with the census. While we no longer can be counted, the census is still not finished. The numbers are not yet done. And the current president has still directed with the current Commerce Secretary that the census deliver final numbers by the end of December. And the Census Bureau itself said that it cannot do that fairly and count all the people. So that's another way in which we can get involved, is insist that Congress extend those deadlines so we can get a fairer count. And there's stuff that we can do here also to correct for bad counts, to make sure that we don't see real discriminatory impacts of that bad census that we had this past decade, or the less than perfect census. And the last thing I just want to flag, and we can talk more about this, is coming out of this election, a lot of people are much more focused on the voting process and what works and what doesn't work, and the ways in which it's discriminatory and the ways in which it creates unnecessary barriers. And there's a real moment now where so many people were mobilized around voting to take that energy and fix the system, insist on reforms, insist that everybody have, at least 2 weeks of early voting and with convenient hours that everybody can make, insist that there be enough polling places, insist that everybody have automatic voter registration, that ballots cast on time but received later aren't thrown out. There's a range of we know what the agenda looks like. Most of these items are already pending in Congress in a bill called HR 1, the For the People Act. We also need to restore the Voting Rights Act, but this is a moment to mobilize both here in New York, where we still have work to do, but also nationally for reform.
To that point, just if I could, we have an opportunity not only on the federal level, but even on the state level. There is a New York State Voting Rights Act. It was actually named after John Lewis after his passing, where while we don't have federal protection, and New York was one of those areas that were covered under the Federal Voting Rights Act in Section 5, like we have an opportunity here in the state of New York, because there is a bill currently in the Assembly and in the Senate on creating a Voting Rights Act for the state of New York. So we don't even have to wait and rely on what Congress is going to do. We can strengthen voter protection. We can create a nonpartisan statewide database. We can raise standards about language access. We can put our own version of pre-clearance in place so that we can protect the rights of voters here in New York. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of making the connection of what's happening federally, but also what's happening here locally. There are a lot of senators on that bill, but not a lot of assembly members signed on. So if you're looking for something to take on as your next project, you can call your assembly member and ask them why they haven't signed on to the Voting Rights Act for New York State yet.
Those kinds of calls and back in the day postcards are the kinds of things that WCC was always tremendous in getting behind. Contacting local legislators and making one's voice heard. Email and staff have to keep track of the information that comes in and what people are saying. So that's important. Wendy, I wonder if you'd be willing to share with us what voting day was like for you.
So I voted the first time. I had like two firsts this year. I voted absentee for the first time during the primaries and discovered how confusing, as somebody who like focuses on voting as an expert, I found it confusing to figure out where to sign my name on our absentee ballot, and was very concerned that if I had a difficult time figuring that out, in all the states where they're going to be tossing ballots for and not giving people opportunity to correct missing signatures or signature mismatches, that might be a really significant barrier. I voted early on a rainy day. I stood in line for 2.5 hours, looped around the block with a whole bunch of other excited people to vote in the pouring rain, and felt great about it. But you know what? We shouldn't have to wait in line for 2.5 hours to vote. In New York, we can do better than that. And one thing I do want to point out is it's what we do here impacts New Yorkers, but it also impacts the rest of the country. People look here as an excuse to justify efforts to suppress the vote elsewhere. So they say, what's the problem that that we created long lines here in Georgia or here in Wisconsin? Look at what they're doing there in New York. they're doing it too. This is not a big deal. Or we're going to cut back on early voting days. Well, we have more than New York. And so I do think that making it better is both important for New Yorkers, but it's also important that we lead and not be a source of pulling people backwards on voting rights.
So Wendy, maybe we can interview each other.
I was frozen there for a bit.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, though. Wendy, what about electronic voting? Where are we in New York State on that?
You mean on voting, remote voting by email, you mean, or voting by the
Or yeah, digital. I guess I should have used the word. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So New York and the rest of the country, this is not, there is no way yet to be able to have online or remote voting over the internet in a secure and safe way. And so I think there's been, there's lots of attempts to try to develop secure methods of online voting. They have all failed. I think every expert and every place that has tried it, it has been, or has piloted it. It has had massive security vulnerabilities. So as a long-term aspirational goal to try to create something that could work, it's certainly still out there, but we are nowhere close to it. And I think that the security risks are so great, and they can be penetrated so easily by so many that nobody is really trying to accomplish this at this point. But, in the long term, I think this is, that this might be possible, but I think it's not imminent.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the wins? What are some of the things that have been strengthened as a result of voter participation? Eljoy, you've got a national perspective as well as local, and actually, Wendy, you do too. What are things that we can actually be proud of? Unmute yourself.
I think we can, like we've said earlier, I think we can be proud about new ways for people to participate in the system. While I agree that we're a long way from the electronic voting, although for me, I still miss the old lever machines. So like for me, it's, I personally do not wish to go to an electronic voting thing. It's something special about like going or participating in voting or something like that. But I think we can celebrate that. I think we can celebrate the increase of participation. I think we can celebrate the increase of candidates. If you look, just a preview of the number of candidates that are going to be running locally in New York City, it's expansive, and it expands the diversity of the city as well. And you'll probably see that across the board, where you see more people in varying communities, and sort of the traditional model of being a lawyer or coming from this particular area and then, running for office or whatever. Now, like, you can be a bartender and run for office. You can be, PTA president and run for office, or just a mom, or volunteer in your community. And sort of, there's no right path. There is no right puzzle piece in terms of representing the people in your community. I think that's something to celebrate as well. And I think also to be able to celebrate having the right people in place, so you can address some of the issues that people want to address, whether that's healthcare, whether that's the economy. Is something I've been saying, for the past couple of months. I don't think people have fully yet grasped or understand the economic situation a lot of city and states are going to be in this post-COVID situation. And so when we get to that first budget negotiation and they're like, okay, we need to cut $5 billion, where does that come from? Not having, and that's another option where we're talking about having people involved in the process, like who's making that decision, who's at the table deciding what gets cut. Is it more programs that speak to and address people who are in a vulnerable state or at the poverty line, our children and others? Or are we cutting something else, right? And preserving so people don't fall further off of a cliff, right? So, or all of those things that I think we can celebrate in being in that particular space. But more importantly, celebrating us for the participation, celebrating that we, in a pandemic situation where everybody is trying to figure out how to care for a loved one, worrying about your family members. I've had, we've had 7 deaths in our family. We've had family members that have had COVID, all of that. And so in the context of all of that, people losing their jobs, losing income, not, their children falling behind because this year educationally, my God, has been great. But in the midst of all of that you see record turnout, record engagement, people stepping up to represent their community, standing in line, sort of all of that stuff. I think we can be proud of where we are and really speak to that piece. I tell people all the time, our government should be participatory, right? So how can people represent you if they don't hear from you and you're not participating in the process? Then you're just letting people off to their own devices, and you never want people left to their own devices.
Wendy?
So I endorse all that. I want to say I on the diversity of representation, which is so important and critical, and which we're actually seeing grow in some areas, and whether it be in like DA races or whether it be at the local level, we are seeing it shrink also. And one area where I just want to flag where we've seen a real shrinkage in the last couple of years that we can do a lot better is on the bench. And I do think that that's also critically important because as people go to court, it actually matters whether or not different perspectives are understood and heard and represented in the courts as well, in terms of both how our law develops and how people are heard in our court system. And so that's one thing I think we can really focus on. Other places where we've done well, I want to lift up a ballot initiative that just passed this in this election in California that we were proud to be part of the committee developing. It was a rights restoration ballot initiative that restored voting rights to 50,000 California citizens with criminal convictions in their past who were either on probation or parole, and that will last. And that passed, and I want to flag it because it is now, the second election in a row where voters were asked to weigh in to vote on restoring voting rights for their fellow citizens. The big ballot initiative in Florida back in 2018 that should have restored voting rights to 1.5 million Floridians with criminal convictions in their past has been thwarted to some extent by the legislature. And every time it seems that voters are asked to vote on whether or not to expand voting access, they do. And that's something to celebrate, like that our country actually, and Americans actually do value voting rights, and they do actually think that their neighbors and fellow citizens should not be deprived of those voting rights. And I think that that's something to build on, and it's something to give us hope as we take the next fight on expanding voting rights across the country. The other thing I want to say is that there's been actually a lot of positive momentum. At the same time as we've been fighting wars against efforts to roll back voting rights in maybe half the states in the country, there's been some steady increases in voting rights and expansions of the voting system like we saw here in New York. Right now, 17 states and DC now have automatic voter registration. That was unthinkable 7 years ago. So that was a very dramatic shift. We now have about over the same amount now have same-day voter registration. Early voting is now the norm across the country. And in this election, there were only 6 states that didn't offer early voting in this election. And that's been a real expansion and movement. And while voting by mail was not a massive form of voting in America, about a quarter of Americans did use mail voting in the last 2 federal elections. The states radically geared up and lifted up vote by mail systems and put in place procedures, and for the most part, with some exceptions, actually made them accessible to almost all Americans in the span of just a couple of months in order to have this election and have everybody be able to participate safely having different choices of methods to do so. That's actually remarkable and things to celebrate of ways in which our voting rights are expanding. Again, there's a lot more work to do. We've also now have 25 states where they've actually gone backwards and have made it harder to vote than it was 10 years ago for example. And so there is definitely, and the Supreme Court has been gutting voting rights, and we'll talk about happy to talk about that a little more, but there's a case currently pending before the US Supreme Court that's raising questions about the constitutionality of the remaining nationwide protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act that the court hobbled significantly back in 2013. So there are certainly risks and threats, but we have seen also a lot of progress, and we have a lot of support among Americans for voting rights that we can build on.
Yeah, it is scary, but also hopeful as well. There's always a balance. We got a wonderful comment from our board chair. Luckily, we didn't have ballot measures this time, she says. Ballotopedia says New York ballots are written at 5th grade level, but only 34% of 8th graders read at grade level. So there's issues of literacy and how ballot measures are written. In addition to what you described, Wendy, you are a highly educated lawyer, and yet when you were filling out your mail-in ballot, there were a lot of questions there. I had the same issue when I was filling out my request for an absentee ballot. I essentially lied because there was nothing on there that gave the reason I was asking for an absentee ballot. I wasn't ill, I wasn't out of the country. So, the whole issue of literacy and education and training is definitely a big one. So thank you, Deb, for that.
And in addition to sort of the language is, the text, for those who do remember ballot measures being on, when we're talking about the ballot measures that were on the municipal ballot last year, even talking about ranked choice voting, which was on the ballot, right? Or the ballot measure that was on the ballot to give us the independent redistricting commission. People didn't know about it. It was also small print. There was a lot of complaints about that, telling me to flip the ballot over, all of those kinds of things. So that's information. And generally we beat up like the Board of Elections and sort of other agencies, sometimes rightfully so, to how they're administering things. But some of it is also like, did we give them enough resources to do the job? Yeah. Right? So did we give them enough money necessary? Did we give them enough time to actually educate people about a particular process? One of the things I'm concerned about ranked choice, while I'm not opposed to it generally, is how are we going to educate people about ranked choice voting in 6 months and execute the ranked choice voting at the same time? So we're going to execute and educate people about it in 6 months.
Building the bike while we're riding it.
And the one piece I'll just add is that's implicit in all this is civics education. I do think that that's something that we should now be demanding that that we invest more in. There are some great programs out there, but it's not mandated, and this is a moment where it would be a good idea to try and change that.
And to that point, Wendy, even when we talk about civics, everybody always talks about putting it in schools for the kids who will be engaged in the future. But what about the millions of adults right now who are actually engaging in the process now? And it's one of the reasons why I founded Sunday Civics, right? Was to use the current political environment to teach people about what's happening, around them and how to actually participate in the process. So that way, again, it's not more of a, why didn't you vote? And why didn't you vote on this ballot measure? And why weren't you involved in participatory budgeting? It's more of, this is participatory budgeting. Here is your entry point. This is how you can engage in that way. And so anytime people talk about civics, they're thinking about kids who don't have the right yet to vote. They can still participate, because remember, voting is but one tool in our civic toolbox, but being able to educate adults who have not only the right to vote, but also have the ability to participate in all of these things, giving them the tools and the entry point for them to participate.
Yeah, I think that underinvestment in, that public education and in the just narrow education about how to run, like what's going to happen in an election, let alone all the other ways in which people can and ought to be able to participate is, I think, important. And we can see what the impact would be by looking at what happened this year. Here, there really was more. There was a public investment more in this kind of education, and you see the fruits of that in people's engagement.
Yeah. If you will indulge me a moment of shameless self-promotion, this is the kind of thing WCC is working on, partner educated. Oh, and I just want to correct myself. It was Debbie Meyer who asked that, who made that point about ballot reform. What's the next frontier for voting reform? What should we be working on? Same-day voter registration, municipal non-citizen voting?
Yeah, so yes, same day voter registration is actually, I think it's already passed here in New York State. It's just waiting on it to be signed so we can implement that as well. So the more that we can increase, and as I mentioned, the Voting Rights Act that on the federal level needs to be reauthorized. Here in the state level, we have an opportunity to do that also. But then even as Wendy was mentioning the lines and how we can do better, that requires investment. That requires a financial investment so that the Board of Elections can hire competent people, that they can train people properly. There was a tremendous, one of the other wins that we should celebrate as well, about the tremendous influx of people serving as poll workers.
Yes.
In the process. Well, we want to continue that trend, right? And so in order to do that, we need a financial investment. Now everybody's going to, come this budget season, we don't have any money, we can't do it. And I made a point to screenshot all of the elected officials who were complaining about the lines and about training and all this stuff like that. I was like, I want to see what that results in an action on your behalf to actually invest in the agencies and the bureaucracy that actually needs to implement this process. But also, on a local and state level, we have to look at how Board of Elections is managed, how it's operated, and what tweaks and things we need to change to make sure it's more accountable and transparent. That's something that also, how elections are administered is not a federal process. That is a, state process, is a local process, and that requires transparency and engagement on that level. But coming in with a new Congress, what commitment will they have to actually invest in that as well? So those are the things that we, can pay attention to and really discuss the next frontier and have this burden. We don't have a constitutional right to vote, but in a lot of states you do. In terms of your state constitution. And so therefore, what else can we do to make sure that we err on the side of protecting voters and their rights, particularly if you have made the effort to cast a ballot, whether that's an absentee, a mail-in vote, an early vote, or a same-day vote, right? We need to make sure that we have infrastructure in place to be able to accept and count that vote and people to participate in the process.
Wendy, I know you have a lot to say about citizens holding legislators to account and holding people counting feet to the fire. What are some ways that we can do that? We can make sure.
So first on the voting side, on the voting reform, I just wanted to lift up or to emphasize a couple of things, which is I do think that there's a moment now where we should be looking hard at how elections are administered in New York and asking our elected officials to hold the Board of Elections, both at the city level and at the state level, accountable and give them the resources they need at the same time, give them the resources they need to run the elections. I think that we have fallen down on oversight of the Board of Elections and making sure that they can you know, that they manage elections, and like we can have all the best rules in the country, but if they're not going to be well administered, and the election administration doesn't have the resources to make it happen, then we're going to have voting rights problems, and people are going to be hours here. So I want to underscore that. That's a real important next step here in New York, and something that is a persistent obstacle here. And at the national level, I wanted to flag, I lift up, I mentioned it again, but there's going to be a real important moment at the beginning of the next Congress, where Speaker Pelosi has said that her first priority is going to be to pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is a package of voting reforms. It will be packaged with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is also really critical. And these are not nice to haves. These are must haves. These are the things that are keeping our system not only from working for everybody, but leaving room for people to manipulate the voting system, the redistricting system, in order to disenfranchise targeted groups of voters or to hold oneself in power. We need to restore the Voting Rights Act and make our voting system fair and work for everybody. And this is no longer just optional. And once that starts, I think I hope that we will all mobilize and make sure and hold a lot of the key members of Congress who are going to be part of that fight are right here in New York State and even in New York City. I think there's a lot of work that we can do here for the nation and for democracy overall. And so I wanted to flag those two things as really coming down the pike immediately. Would address a lot of the problems we saw in this election. I think they need to be bolstered a little bit, but that's something that I hope we can do. And I wanted to just urge, and maybe this is what you were referring to, that after an election's over and you vote for, and your candidate of choice wins, and they're campaigning on issues that you like, that doesn't end it. You know, we have seen again and again when we thought that, when Democrats took the chamber here in New York, took both chambers in New York, we thought that we would see an easy glide path, for example, to passing small donor public financing, which I mentioned before, which everyone in the assembly was behind. But it was a very heavy lift and organizing effort in order to get the members to push over the finish line the things that they had been supporting beforehand. They need to hear from us. So election is just the first step in the process of winning all the things that we think we need to do to fix our system to make it work for everybody. We need to keep up the pressure. Fortunately that campaign, bore fruit and led to a good outcome, but this is just the starting point, and we need to keep the pressure up.
Definitely. Even with improvements to mail-in voting and early voting, only about 60% of registered New Yorkers voted. What more can we do to increase voter turnout right here?
So I think things we've been talking about are things that would increase voter turnout. And so this is, I think that's, I don't know that there's anything different than make the system accessible to everybody, tell everybody to explain it to everybody, and then mobilize them to use their power. I guess the one other thing I wanted to add, though, on in New York, that we are still behind the ball also on rights for people with past convictions. And I do want to say that's another important legislative priority that we can be moving right now and putting pressure on, as the rest of the country is passing laws to remove obstacles that disenfranchise people. New York should not be at the back of the line here.
Yeah. Perhaps Bloomberg Philanthropies will be helpful with that in our state. And then there was one more question that somebody sent that I can't find, I feel bad, but anyway, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you, Eljoy and Wendy. Really very thoughtful, insightful, and also very inspiring. I don't know about everybody else, but I feel like now I have information that can give me more control over what's happening in my community and how I can leverage my power as an individual citizen to really make a difference. Advocating for fair redistricting after the census, going to community board meet, all things that WCC provides information for and education about. So this is extremely helpful. I do want to thank you both again. It's been great to have you with us and great to give us a lot to think about and giving us tools to use. I feel like we've got our work plan now. Wendy, any last words for us? Words of encouragement or inspiration?
No, I thank you so much for having me, and it's been a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm so glad that you guys are mobilizing and doing this important work for New Yorkers and our democracy. So thank you.
Eljoy, you want to send us out with some inspiration?
Thank you so very much for the invitation, and I look forward to everyone's participation this coming municipal election cycle. But really, I look forward to hearing the stories of people being engaged in other aspects besides electoral politics, right? That I look forward to people, overwhelming response in terms of redistricting and sort of how that will shape out. I look forward to seeing people on their own engaging in education about ranked choice voting and other systems that we'll be using here in New York City. I look forward to hearing elected officials complain about people calling their office. Yeah. And I do get that a lot. So, so I look forward to people staying engaged, staying active, and thinking up new ways of, how to address some of the issues we will need, particularly coming out of this COVID pandemic. One thing I tell people, and it's the last thing I'll say, elected officials don't know everything. Quiet as it's kept. They are not, a lot of the stuff that they champion through, whether it's legislation and budget or whatever, come from other people, come from lobbyists. They can also come from you. And so we have to think about ourselves as that lobbyist for our community, for our constituency groups, for any of the groups that we belong to, and think of elected officials as the tools, one of the tools we have in our toolbox in order to get things done.
Great, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining in. Thanks also for your questions and comments. We look forward to seeing you at the next WCC Table Talk. Have a great night.
Thanks.